Welcome back to Intellectual Potluck, where I am very, very behind schedule, but it is for a good reason. So I've been studying for my Australian citizenship test, so that's been taking up pretty much all of my time. But through it, I found some really interesting historical topics to research, and I've dug a bit deeper into some of those, and so we're going to be talking about one of those today. So to any Aussies listening, you can probably guess where this is going to go. I'm going to be talking about Gallipoli. Gallipoli is a very famous battle that happened during World War I, and it was a complete military disaster. It was a brutal, drawn-out campaign that not only failed to meet its objectives, but cost thousands and thousands of lives. But somehow, this disaster of a campaign has become a huge part of Australia's culture and Australia's identity. So I want to have a look today at what actually happened with Gallipoli and how it ended up being such a cultural cornerstone for Australia. So let's get into it. I'll give a bit of background. I'm sure we've all heard of World War I, but depending on what country you're from, the history that you know of it might be very, very different. Being British, I know a lot of the things from the British perspective, but I actually hadn't really studied Gallipoli much at all because it just doesn't come up in our narrative, whereas when you come over to Australia, it is the main thing that you hear about. So I'll give a bit of context that we're all working from the same information. So World War I broke out in 1914. And by early 1915, the Western Front had already reached a stalemate that they could not get out of. So at this point in time, the Western Front stretched right through France and Belgium, and neither side was able to make any ground. Trench warfare had really taken hold, and so we had millions of soldiers on both sides that were completely bogged down in mud and barbed wire and artillery fire, and neither side had much to show for it. We were just losing lives, and the conflict was going nowhere. Every single inch of ground that was made was costing thousands of lives. So the generals on both sides knew something had to change. And the Allied powers, which were Britain, France, Russia, and all of their partner nations, they were currently facing a hell of a lot of pressure because the war had already gone on for longer than they'd expected, and as we know, it would go on for a hell of a lot longer as well. With no clear direction to break this deadlock, they were feeling really stuck and facing a really serious war of attrition. So they had this plan to open up a new front in the east and shift the combat over there. They saw an opportunity with one of Germany's key strategic allies, which was the Ottoman Empire. Their plan was to fight their way through the Dardanelles Strait, which was a very narrow and very heavily fortified waterway in what's now modern-day Turkey. They hoped that if they could seize control of the strait, then they could advance on Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, and completely knock the Ottomans out of the war. Strategically, it was quite a smart move, but a very, very bold move with high stakes. But there are a few key advantages to it, so it would relieve a lot of the pressure from Russia, who were really, really struggling at this time in the Eastern Front. It could also secure the Suez Canal, which was vital to the British Empire at the time. And it could also potentially open up a seaport to be able to get more resources and supplies to Russia via the Black Sea, because a lot of the ports in the north were frozen over. So by forging a path through the south, they could relieve even more pressure off Russia. So success in this campaign could massively swing the tide of the war. And one of the strongest advocates of this plan is a very well-known name, Winston Churchill. At the time, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, so he pushed very, very hard to get this idea through. He was absolutely convinced that the British and French ships could push through the Ottoman defences just through sheer firepower, just going in all guns blazing. And to be honest, he completely dismissed a lot of the intelligence that they were getting back, that the Ottomans were very prepared and that they were better armed than they thought, and he didn't really see them as a big threat. He thought they'd just be able to plough through. Of course, in hindsight, now we know that was dangerously optimistic. But Churchill's opinion was also very well respected. And it wasn't just Churchill who believed that the Ottoman Empire were weak at this time. There was a bit of a perception across Europe that the Ottoman Empire was dying, and it was often referred to as the sick man of Europe. Generally, people thought it was disorganized, outdated, and just couldn't keep up with modern-day armies. This assumption was very, very wrong. The Ottomans were fighting to defend their homeland. And that home turf advantage cannot be underestimated. They were really well dug in, very familiar with the land, and they had some very, very experienced and knowledgeable officers leading them. Most notably was Mustafa Kemal. He was a very well-respected general, but he would also later go on to become the founder of what is now Turkey. So a very influential, very powerful figure. But anyway, so the Allies had this perception that it was going to be an easy battle. And based on these very flawed assumptions, they underprepared, underplanned, and were very overconfident. They knew that this campaign was a long shot, but probably massively underestimated the risks associated. They probably thought if they couldn't achieve objectives, they'd still be okay. And it was a gamble that they were willing to take to try and change the tide of the war. And so let's talk about what actually happened in the campaign. We've done all the prep, we can see how we got here, how they thought it was a good idea. So what actually happened? And let's start with the day that is now commemorated every single year in Australia and I believe New Zealand. ANZAC Day, April 25th, 1915. This was the day of the landing. And right from day one, things started to go wrong. The ANZAC troops, which is the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps, they'd been training for weeks in Egypt. And when the time came, they were due to land in this fairly gentle, sloping beach near Gallipoli. The plan was for the ANZACs to try and seize the higher ridgelands very quickly, and this would then cut off the Ottomans from being able to send reinforcements against the British and French troops. The British and French troops were landing elsewhere, and the plan was that once the ANZACs had secured their location and cut off the Ottomans from their reinforcements, the ANZACs would then eventually link up with the Allied forces and join them in their campaigns. So now, that was the plan. What actually happened was the ANZACs ended up landing on a completely different place. Due to a series of navigational errors, the darkness, poor communication, bad currents, everything was just really working against them. The landing boats ended up drifting north, and so instead of landing at the intended beach, the ANZACs landed at what is now known as ANZAC Cove. And this is a very narrow strip of beach, which is flanked either side by very steep ridges, gullies, and a lot of shrubland. It was really, really brutal terrain to try and fight through, and the Ottomans were prepared for it. The soldiers that were waiting for the ANZACs were not the disorganized, chaotic troops that they had been told to expect. The Ottomans were organised, well prepared, and strategically positioned to be able to make the most of this situation. Within moments of landing, the ANZACs were faced with rifle and machine gun fire from above them. They managed to gain a bit of a toehold, but the price for gaining that was so steep. By the end of the first day, thousands were dead and injured. And despite continued efforts through April, May, and then even into June, the Allies were just unable to break through. And the Gallipoli campaign, just like those campaigns on the Western Front, reached a stalemate. The Australians and the New Zealanders were trying repeatedly to push inland, but the terrain was working against them, and they had a lot of poor planning working against them as well. Their generals and commanders just were not coming up with the right ideas to help them succeed. At Cape Helles, the French and British forces were also suffering severe casualties, and they kept launching offences, none of which were succeeding. But that's not to say that this was a completely one-sided battle. The Ottomans were also facing severe casualties. One of the most noteworthy and bloodiest days of this campaign was May 19th. So the Ottomans launched a massive counterattack. Around 42,000 Ottoman troops went out to fight the Anzac lines, and it didn't work. The Allies were able to stand their ground, and the Ottomans suffered over 10,000 casualties from just this one campaign, and over 3,000 of those were just in one day. And I think that campaign in particular made both sides very nervous about launching a huge offensive because the risks were so great. So both sides dug in, and Gallipoli began to look a lot like the trench warfare that was on the Western Front. And just like on the Western Front, the conditions were awful. They could not stay like this indefinitely. They were coming into the summer months, so the heat was brutal. There was a massive issue with getting clean water. And because there was such an issue getting clean water, there was also a lot of disease, particularly dysentery, which was making its way through the troops. And then, of course, you've got the constant threat of artillery fire around you. On both sides of this campaign, daily life was unimaginably hard. So this brings us around to August. And in August, the Allies made one major attempt to try and break this deadlock. This became known as the August Offensive and was made up of quite a few different battles. So I'll name a few of the battles to give you a bit of an idea, but you'll be able to see very quickly how this offensive went. At Lone Pine, the Australian troops attacked some very heavily fortified Ottoman trenches. So they managed to take position, but the cost of taking that position was huge. They lost over 2,000 Australian soldiers in just 4 days. And then if we look at another battle, which was the Neck. So the Australian Light Horse were ordered to charge across open ground in waves. And this battle has gone down as an almost legendary blunder. So the plan had been to coordinate these waves with New Zealand forces who were advancing nearby. And so the idea was that if the timing was right, then the Ottomans would be caught unawares and wouldn't be able to fight on both sides. But they got the timing wrong. And so the result was that wave after wave of soldiers charged into the Ottoman machine guns and were just mowed down instantly. They say that in less than an hour, 230 men were killed. And they made no gain out of this. And then there were a lot of other battles trying to gain higher ground, some of which succeeded, but very few of which they were able to hold on to for very long. So the end result was that their plan for a massive offensive had failed, and the troops were exhausted. The Ottomans had held their ground, the Allies were holding their ground, and the deadlock continued. And then, of course, we start heading into the colder months, where everything just gets more and more brutal. So no longer battling with the summer heat, people were suddenly faced with freezing cold rains, really cold night conditions, and of course with wet and cold conditions comes things like trench foot and frostbite, and of course more illness. And on top of that, of course, morale was absolutely in the tank. They stuck it out for a few more months, but by December it became very, very clear that the campaign was a complete failure, and High Command began to plan a withdrawal. The ANZACs and British troops were evacuated on December 20th of 1915, and the final Allied forces left Cape Helles by early January of 1916. And somewhat ironically, this withdrawal is deemed to be the most successful part of the campaign, not just because they were withdrawing and getting away from all of the terrible warfare, but because they had a strategic plan on how to evacuate everyone safely, and it actually succeeded. Not one single soldier was lost in the evacuation, which is amazing. So what they had done was they set up some water-triggered rifles to keep firing after the troops had gone to try and simulate there being people there. They also had campfires and dummy figures which were left behind. And they abandoned a lot of supplies as well, just to give the illusion that there was still people there. And this seemed to buy them just enough time for the Ottomans to not realize that they'd gone until it was too late, and they managed to get away. Now, I know this has been a lot more grim than my normal episodes, so thank you if you have bared with me through all that. But I think it's really, really important to acknowledge the hardship and struggle that was actually faced in this campaign, and not just the legend that has come with it. So the more and more that I read about this campaign, it got me wondering, why did this particular campaign become such a legend for Australia and New Zealand? It was an absolute disaster, and yet it is one of the most honoured and commemorated in Australia. And I think I've been able to put together a few key reasons why this is. So to start with, I think we have to look at the timing. This was the first major military action that had been taken by Australia and New Zealand since Australia had become a federation, because that happened in 1901, something else I had to learn for my citizenship, which means they'd only been a federated nation for 14 years by the time World War I broke out. Gallipoli was the first time that Australians had fought as Australians and not British colonial units. I think along with that came some national pride and a bit of a sense of wanting to prove yourself on an international stage. This would be one of the first examples of a national story that is drawing everyone's attention. It became part of people's shared identity here. And I think as well the qualities that they reflect in the soldiers in this battle, bravery, mateship, endurance, they all came to define what is now known as the ANZAC spirit, and these are reflected in the values that Australians aspire to have. And I think on an individual level, people felt very, very connected to these soldiers and to these values that they represented. Gallipoli was a real time of national mourning, and as the names of the casualties were making their way over to the country, the losses were so huge that they would be felt everywhere. Over 8,700 Australians were killed in the Gallipoli campaign, along with 2,700 New Zealanders. And this is a very, very significant loss given the size of the populations as well at that time. The losses would have been felt in every nook and cranny of the country. And so everyone would have had an emotional connection to this battle. And I think this is something to really not lose sight of. I think history very often kind of zooms out from the personal picture and just looks at a much broader picture. But I think the human impact is what makes Gallipoli so special to Australians. So I had a look at some primary source and first-person accounts from the time. I want to give you guys a few examples just to really explain where I'm coming from. So there are a few stories that have become very well known. So the first that I'm going to talk about is John Simpson, who was a stretcher bearer for the 3rd Australian Field Ambulance. He came ashore during the landing of 25th of April. So he was there right from the start, and he was killed just a few weeks later. But in the time that he was there, he became known for using donkeys to transport wounded men from the fighting to the first aid station in ANZAC Cove, and putting himself in danger but using this innovative way of being able to get more and more people to help. And there are quite a lot of letters and diary entries that really bring his story to life. Victor Laidlaw, who was in the 2nd Field Ambulance, he actually wrote in his diary about Simpson's death, and he said one day he was bringing a man down from the trenches, and coming down an incline, he was shot right through the heart. It is regretted on all sides, as this chap was noticed by all, and everybody got to know him. One couldn't miss him, as he used to always work with his donkey, cheerful and willing. This man goes to his death as a soldier. And accounts like this made their way back home and were shared with Australians. And another point of view, which has actually become surprisingly significant in how this story is told, is actually from Mustafa Kemal, who was the Turkish general that I mentioned earlier on in the episode. So he was commanding the ANZAC's opposition, and he is very often credited with being able to keep them at bay. But after the war, he made a speech honouring ANZAC soldiers, and he said, "Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore rest in peace. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom." And I think a statement like that coming from the opposition is just such a powerful gesture of reconciliation and humanity. And it really shows the shared respect on both sides of this conflict. I'll include some more things that I found in the description because there was quite a lot, but the point that I'm trying to make is that these emotive stories have shaped the way that we see Gallipoli. The way that it's remembered is all about the emotive and human impact. It's not about the terrible strategic decisions that were made. It's about the people and everything that they represent. The remote beaches and trenches are portrayed as a miniature crucible where Australian values were born. And the commanders who made these decisions are highlighted as being gallantry, even though the campaign failed. And part of this is also in how the media chooses to share this information. So some of it would be about trying to save face, taking away from the strategic disaster and focusing on the heroic sacrifice. But that's what stayed with Australians and has resonated to this day. So ANZAC Day, being honoured on April 25th, was observed from 1916. It's become a national day of remembrance in both Australia and New Zealand, and it commemorates all who have served in war, not just in Gallipoli. So they do dawn services, marches, moments of silence right across the countries. Every single year, thousands of people gather at dawn, and it's such a significant part of Australia's legacy. And look, historians will continue to debate for forever on whether, the legend and the mythology romanticizes war and maybe even overshadows other moments of Australia's history. Others will see it as a necessary part of identity and sacrifice. Personally, I don't think both arguments are mutually exclusive. I think most civilizations have romanticized war in their stories, and World War I in particular does get romanticized a lot to try and mask some of the horrors of war, but that doesn't take away from the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers. And so even though Gallipoli was not a victory, that doesn't take away from its significance. And that's that for this one. I hope you all enjoyed this. Like I say, it was a bit grimmer than some of my other ones. So thank you for everyone who made it to the end. I thought it was something really interesting that I enjoyed reading more into after I made it through the citizenship test. As stressful as the test was, I'm glad that it pointed me in this direction of being able to research things. Yeah, let me know if there's any particular topics that you guys would want me to do. More than happy to look into absolutely anything. And I've managed to claim a lot of my time back now that I'm not studying for that stupid test. So I have a lot more time to do research. So I will see you all next time.